In this presentation, I will be talking about African American Gothic literature, and more specifically, how these works help readers understand the positions of African Americans within American society, both throughout history and in the modern day. Before I begin, I would like to say that the materials in this presentation are for educational use only. I do not own anything. All of the materials belong to the original copyright holders. It is first imperative to understand what Gothic literature is. As Liggins writes, it first emerged in the 18th century in Europe. Gothic stories were meant to terrify readers, but also to force them to reflect on the threats and anxieties that individuals and societies often confront, or, in other cases, sweep under the rug. There are a few common traits of and themes to be found in Gothic literature. These stories often involve characters that address superstition and topple authoritative structures. The characters are often faced with the return of thoughts and feelings that they had previously repressed. In other words, the past haunts the present, which is especially common in storylines in which characters are haunted by their ancestors' actions. Unstable power dynamics and tyrannical patriarchal forces often come into play as well. Cucurella Ramon sums this all up with this quote here. In the Gothic literary genre, the past can never be left behind, for it brings forward the dark reality of the present. Now we have to figure out what happens when African American literature merges with Gothic literature. As Toni Morrison describes, through the simple expedient of demonizing and reifying the range of color on a palette, African Americanism makes it possible to say and not to say, to inscribe and erase, to escape and engage, to act out and act on, to historicize and render timeless. It provides a way of contemplating chaos and civilization, desire and fear, and a mechanism for testing the problems and blessings of freedom. So, in other words, African American literature tends to grapple with subjects that are often left unsaid, or that are erased by history and culture. These stories then are vehicles for African Americans to think about identity, freedom, and other such complicated topics. Considering that, African American literature, both in today's age and the past, tends to have traits that are traditionally Gothic. In these stories, the past haunts the present, and the characters are forced to grapple with power, freedom, and identity, just like those of classic Gothic novels. Due to this, my thesis is that African American literature is deeply intertwined with Gothic literature, which can be seen throughout the many novels I will be discussing in this presentation, suggesting that, to tell the stories of a people who have been historically oppressed and suppressed, the best method is to utilize a genre that inherently thinks about the past haunting the present, tyranny, and freedom. To begin, Charles Chesnutt's 1899 short story collection, The Conjure Woman, deals heavily with the past of slavery haunting the present. In one story from this novel, Po Sandy, an enslaved man named Slandy is turned into a tree by his lover, who is a witch. They do this so he can stop traveling on his master's whims, and then she can turn him back into a human when they desire. However, his master cuts down Sandy's tree and turns him into lumber to build a kitchen. The other slaves can hear Sandy's screams and groans from the floorboards, and the kitchen is eventually dismantled because of his haunting presence. Essentially, the Gothic wailing and haunting inspirit the material body of the slave, as Goldner writes, with Sandy's ghost forcing those in the present to remember slavery, even if many want to forget it existed. Next, Nella Larsen's Passing came out in 1929. In this story, two black women, who were once childhood friends, re-encounter each other in adulthood. One of the women, Irene, has been living as a black woman, but has a light enough complexion that she could sometimes pass for white. Claire, on the other hand, passes as a white woman full-time and has separated herself from her African heritage. As the story goes on, they become entrenched in one another's lives and force each other to think about themselves in relation to their racial identities. In this instance, W.E.B. Du Bois' idea of the veil and double consciousness comes into play. The veil refers to that which hides the black world from the white world, while double consciousness suggests that African Americans live in a constant condition of split consciousness in which they try to reconcile their African heritage with a dominant white culture. While the story is not necessarily Gothic, these elements are used in Gothic ways, as these relate back to the themes of doppelgangers, complicated identities, and split personalities that are common in Gothic literature. For these reasons, Claire's reintroduction to Irene's life forces her to address her static idea of racial identity, and both frightens yet intrigues her as she makes her remember subjects which she had previously repressed. Wagner writes, embodying at once a double of herself, a Gothic sight, and a sublime facade, Claire disrupts Irene's static and superficial notions of race and sex. Claire terrorizes and astonishes by exhuming these concepts that Irene has long ago settled, defined, and put to rest, which is exactly the return of the repressed. Wagner overall just sums this up nicely, saying, by her very lack of racial markings, Claire forces Irene to explore her African-Americanness. By coercing her into an uncontrollable situation where Irene must look at race and racism directly, she can no longer ignore this issue. With all this in mind, while Passing might not be a Gothic story, its themes, the return of the repressed, the past haunting the present, and the grappling with one's identity suggest that the African American experience in Larson's mind is quite Gothic. Next, Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 novel Their Eyes Were Watching God has Gothic elements as well, although to a lesser extent. The story at first appears to be something of a character study or even a coming-of-age novel, as it recounts the main character, Janie's, tumultuous journey into adulthood. Towards the end of the novel, Janie has married a man named Tea Cake, settled in a black community in the Everglades, and has found work harvesting beans. Her life seems peaceful, but it is upended once a hurricane hits. Tea Cake gets bit by a rabid dog and ultimately tries to kill her, forcing her to kill him in self-defense. Here, then, the Gothic elements manifest in Tea Cake's uncannily split identity, as he transforms from Janie's loving husband into her would-be murderer. While the story is less Gothic than the others, this genre change, as Curran calls it, marks a descent into Gothicism. Curran suggests that Hurston did this so as to force her readers to realize that, even in black communities, they were not immune to the prejudices and hierarchical issues that were typically associated with white America. Richard White's 1940 novel Native Son deals with Gothicism to a greater extent. In this story, the main character, Bigger, works for a white family. One night, he goes out with the family's daughter, Mary, and her boyfriend. When he brings her home, she is drunk and he has to carry her into her bedroom. Her blind mother enters the room and he covers Mary's face with a pillow so that she does not tell her that he, a black man, is in her bedroom. In doing this, he unwittingly suffocates her and then decides to burn her body in the house's furnace so no one will find her, which is very reminiscent of Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. Eventually, he kills his own girlfriend, Bessie, as well, as she knows what he has done and fears what she could do with his knowledge. Considering this, Native Son is Gothic because it blurs the line between monster and man and also exists in a larger, intertextually Gothic canon. Bigger is a murderer because societal norms forced him to become one. It's something of a self-fulfilled prophecy, as society was against him from the moment he was born because of his skin color, and he ended up confirming those fears by accidentally killing Mary and then purposefully killing Bessie. Toni Morrison's Beloved is probably the pinnacle of African American Gothic literature. The story is told somewhat non-linearly, but it is revealed by the end that Setha, the main character, once killed her baby daughter and would have killed her other kids as well, out of the fear that they would be forced back into slavery. In the present, Beloved, the baby that she had killed, has returned from the dead as a ghost and destroys Setha's life. Setha is thrilled to have her daughter back, but she is consumed by her guilt, which Beloved relishes in. Eventually, Setha's other daughter, Denver, helps to banish Beloved, finally freeing their home from her influence, as she had spent years haunting them before she manifested physically. While this is the most basic plot summary and barely covers what a beautiful novel this is, the Gothic elements are extremely obvious here. The supernatural, the return of the repressed, and the past haunting the present all come into play in this novel to a great extent. Here, Beloved's haunting of Setha symbolizes the past of slavery and the present life of the former slave, and forces her to remember that which she has tried to forget. This obviously parallels the fact that so many tried to forget slavery, suggesting that slavery must not be forgotten, but remembered and atoned for. Goldner perfectly summarizes this, saying, Beloved's ending matches the desire to forget the horror of slavery with the impossibility of doing so. All in all, these novels present us with a clear understanding of African American Gothic literature. It is a genre in which the past haunts the present, in which conflicts that have been settled are reopened, and in which characters are forced to grapple with their racial identities and their places in a white society that does not welcome them. As Bryant writes, Gothic literature gives African American writers agency and a vehicle to participate in discourses that have often shunned them or objectified them. subjectify them. Additionally, for many African American writers, Gothic literature is the perfect tool to represent the horrors of slavery, but also the ways in which it still impacts our culture even in the 21st century. In relation to slavery, Goldner perfectly sums this up, writing, Gothic representations of slavery themselves have become a mode of haunting, as they carry the past into the present in order to indicate the unfinished business of addressing American slavery. The task remains unfinished also because American understandings of freedom remain problematic. Thank you for watching, and here are my works cited pages.